Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Brittany Greenfield, CEO and founder of Wabi. And today I'm going to talk about how we can finally remove that security friction from our DevOps pipeline. We've all spent a lot of time, effort, money implementing DevOps. And wherever you are in your maturity and life cycle in doing this, we still find that there's one piece left, and that's security that we fail to actually automate and integrate, more importantly, into our DevOps processes. So today we'll talk a little bit about how we can finally reach those efficiencies and remove the security bottleneck as part of our DevOps pipeline. Unfortunately, since we are all virtual today, I did want to go ahead and share a little bit about myself. Not only am I the founder and CEO of Wabi, which helps bridge the gap between security and development, but I happen to love wine. I just wanted you to get to know me. And in fact, a little bit more about that is the fact that in a different life, I actually have done some competitive wine tasting. And I often look at wine and DevOps as not being too dissimilar, in that there are a lot of pieces and processes and people that come together to create this flow of wine out of our bottle eventually, or whatever your beverage of choice but it doesn't just happen overnight. We set the right processes, we identify what happens as we go through that process to make educated decisions. So in winemaking, you actually, you never know what the weather's going to be, right? In development, you never know what your market constraints are going to be or when a new project's going to come up. And there's got to be a flow and a process, not to make sure you stay on a singular track, but rather so you can make educated decisions as you move through the process of making wine, or as is more ordinary for the rest of us here, or delivering software, delivering an application. That process is not meant to constrain, but rather to make sure we keep that code shipping. And that's just like, we go to a bar and it's wine for everybody. This is fantastic. And that's what that DevOps revolution has done. And it's brought in, it's not just about speed, it's about efficiency and making sure we're doing the right things at the right time to keep that wine or applications flowing into our glasses. Yet, if you go ask a security professional, what DevOps has done is just spray it all over the place. Oh my God, there is code everywhere. What are we going to do? How are we going to secure it? And that has become this conflict, and what has created a bottleneck in development and around the concept of application security. Now, more traditional application security might leave you thinking that it's just about the code and scanning the code and what vulnerabilities are in the code. But really, application security is about this process of developing, adding, and testing security features within applications to prevent vulnerabilities, right? Vulnerabilities, when we stop thinking about them being these big databases that everybody's contributing to, and we're just waiting for the next big one to show up and go into some kind of crisis mode because it turns out we have it as an organization, and start thinking about how our code in this is software-powered world, right? We all know software is eating the world, and it's going to continue doing that. How the code is going to actually deliver all of those security practices. It gives you a bit of a different lens on what application security is. No longer, I'm just going to go back to this definition, no longer is it about saying, hey, we got to go make sure we essentially don't have security bugs, but saying, what are all the components we have to align and bring into our workflow, not just so we can get, the thumbs up from security, but so we can make sure our code is supporting the security risk profile as part of our overall business risk profile. So that's all good and well to say, hey, one, and application security is about more than just scanning lines of code. It's about all the components that secure it and all the ways we configure our code and write our code to enable that. Two, it should be integrated as part of our processes. makes sense. We've just spent a lot of time and money to ensure we have a DevOps process, so we're doing the right things at the right time. But it doesn't solve the systemic issue that we're going to have more developers than DevOps than security, right? With ratios of 100 developers to 10 DevOps to 1 security professional, we are inherently creating a bottleneck when we leave application security out of our process and fail to integrate it into the DevOps lifecycle. So what happens? As many of you here are probably familiar with, a lot of times that 1 security professional becomes the single block, the wall, the cork, if you will, that keeps all that code in as they're struggling to go through checklists in Excel or PDFs, or they're running around trying to process all the vulnerability data that they collect from multiple sources and normalize it to say, it's not that we have 10 tools with 30 new vulnerabilities each, and therefore 300 vulnerabilities, but maybe it's more like 35 to 4 new vulnerabilities that we've just done testing, or even trying to figure out the right time, right? This is my PSA for the AppSec side of the world, right? Give them a bit of a break. I've been known to say development sometimes sees AppSec either as a traffic cop or even worse, a grim reaper coming by and saying, you did something wrong. And that's because they're getting not just 100-fold the amount of code that they can process and the data related to that. They're also coming into the game late. And so, when they're not empowered with data, the same way that you're not empowered with security data, of course, they're going to act more like a wall or a cork than an enabler. But as we all know, when you leave something corked up for too long, and you have the power of it trying to move out of a bottle or out of a production pipeline, eventually it's going to start seeping out. Oh, and there's nothing worse than that. Whatever your favorite beverage is, I'm sure we've all experienced this, where in wine, it's called being corked, right? You taste and you go, oh God, this came out wrong, right? And it's because no matter how good the processes were there was seepage causing it to go bad. And when code seeps out of a security process, we're just playing roulette, waiting for that moment that either the vulnerabilities just play catch up with us and they become a drag on our backlog, no different than the way you have to go deal with technical debt. Or even worse, you have to then, security does get to trump the code ship, and development doesn't just get to say, hey, this is great, we can ship it and we'll fix this stuff later. Instead, security comes in and says, nope, this is actually a complete blocker. You've got to go rewrite everything you've already done. Or it may just be, in their mind, you've got to go fix this one thing. But fixing that one thing means you have to throw away 3 months of work. And ultimately, a breach could happen. And nobody wants a breach. It's not about pointing fingers. It's about making sure you're prepared for the right information, with the right information, to do the right things at the right time, so that you can say, if a breach does happen, we did all the right things and we accepted risk in the right place. That's how we prevent essentially shipping security corked code, rather. Right. We all get this. This is important. When I started speaking on this 3-4 years ago, it wasn't quite as commonplace. But this year alone, 60% of rapid development teams will have DevSecOps processes embedded. Yet, we know 48% of companies are regularly pushing vulnerable code knowingly. So where's this disconnect? We know we have to have security embedded in our DevOps process, yet we're still choosing to push vulnerable code. How is that happening, right? That's the conundrum nowadays, that this term DevSecOps is not new, right? This is now part of our vernacular, yet are we really not doing anything about it? So basically what we've said is, we're doing DevSecOps, but we don't actually have any of that integration stuff that we do with the rest of our DevOps pipeline. So of course, you're actually not going to get the benefits of integrating security in if you haven't actually integrated it. There was a trend of security evangelists that was great from a cultural perspective, but people aren't scalable. There's been increased training of development teams. Fantastic. Security really is everybody's job, but how can it be everybody's job if you don't tell them what they have to do? At the end of the day, organizations have embraced DevOps and the CI/CD so that they can ship code that is always ready to be shipped, develop code that is always ready to be shipped in line with not just the specs, but what the business needs. And what the business needs is both to meet market demands as well as to manage its risk. And cybersecurity isn't just about saving face. It's about managing all components of business risk, delivery risk, productivity risk, and then of course, ultimately, preventing your application from being turned into a weapon that enables a breach. So why have we failed to actually, none of what I'm saying is a surprise to any of you here, I'm sure. So why have we failed to successfully integrate, not just shove security in the middle of DevOps, which you all are probably, I'm sure if I got to be in a room with you all, everybody would probably be going, yeah, it kind of feels that way sometimes, that it's just been shoved down into different places and creating new bottlenecks, many more bottlenecks sometimes even. Why have we failed to do that? Well, that's because of a concept called Conway's Law. And what that says is any organization that designs a system will produce a design whose structure is a copy of the organization's communication structure. More simply, if you guys remember from a couple of years ago, this, right? Where, well-known organizational hierarchies became popularized as the communication and cultural structures. And while, it's not to say that security and development are necessarily pointing guns at each other, or that, or they're sitting in some harmonious kumbaya circle at other companies. What it means is that DevOps had an advantage when they merged development and operations. They had a cultural similarity, a communication plane that they dealt with that was the same, right? It was about making sure code shipped efficiently. But that you were making the trade-offs, right? I often say at least development and operations were both speaking the same language. It may have been different regional dialects, but at least they were both speaking the same language. Their goal was to get code out the door. That was literally their job. But security and development live in two different worlds. This process enables development to make a decision and make educated decisions as the code is being developed about what is good enough to ship, right? That's the decision everybody in this room, virtual or otherwise, yes, my dog makes this decision every day too, makes to say what's good enough and what can be fixed later. Yet security has been living in a world where it's binary. Think just about the antivirus on your computer, or that it pops up and it doesn't say this is bad-ish. Would you maybe like us to stop it? It says this is bad, we stopped it. And that's the realm security's been living in. And so their goal is to make sure that code is not introducing new risk. It is actually not to stop you from shipping it. But what their goal is, PSA number 2 for security, is to make sure that that in line with the risk standards that the company has set out, so that their policies and procedures, and I'm going to double tap on this word procedure, I'd be grandly gesturing on the stage if we were together, their procedures make sure that risk is accepted correctly. So when you, as development and operations teams, have been living in a world where all you get to see is this big PDF or Excel spreadsheet, or worse, an email saying, did you check all of these things? And nobody had told you you were supposed to check them. Of course, there's going to be a cultural issue. Oh, and this is how, unfortunately, we have created what I lovingly term the DevSecOps hairball, where security, and this isn't just security's fault, right? Security, as part of the DevOps revolution, was shoved into the middle of DevOps, right? Literally, we put the word in the middle of DevOps. What does that actually mean? DevSecOps. What that meant was we came up with a lot of tools to secure different components of the DevOps pipeline. But those tools still didn't talk with each other and didn't really talk with the overall DevOps process, right? Because DevOps, when we get back to fundamentals, is about flow and continuous improvement and setting a process, knowing what you're supposed to do in advance, and then knowing or not whether or not it was done. And when it wasn't done, who accepted that risk? So sticking something in the middle of it, that's never going to work. And this is how we didn't just end up with a single bottleneck, but bottlenecks every place, because there are so many different places that security has to be implemented. It's not just the application security manager, right? His job is actually the strategy of deciding what the right policies and procedures and controls are. And so then we had this one person trying to communicate that out to hundreds of stakeholders. And that's the developer, who has to know what he's supposed to do down at the feature level. That's the architect that needs to know what she needs to do to actually build that application and how it needs to be configured. The PM that needs to know the various components so she can plan for that project to be on time, on spec, on budget. And then that's just in the dev organization. Let's get out of that. Let's get into the GRC, right? What is compliance? What has been followed? I suspect we can all say we've sat with auditors for many hours in an interrogation rather than a conversation about why was this risk accepted. So we started creating this DevSecOps hairball with best of intentions, just started creating all these bottlenecks all over the place. And without it, right? And as a result, we have failed to actually integrate application security into DevOps because there are all these tools. We have left teams, and both on the development and operations side, awash in data without information. Right? I can say it's 30 degrees. Well, I'm here in Boston today. 30 degrees in Boston, not too normal, not great, but not normal, right? If we'd all been sitting in Florida today, and I said it was 30 degrees, we'd all be pretty angry and there'd be something wrong, right? We'd be very concerned. So when you have too many security tools and too much security data without any way to process the information, that is what is holding us up from actually integrating it. And we're not just talking about one handful too many tools or two handfuls too many tools. Almost 2/3 of organizations are using more than 10 just application security tools, with 22% of them using more than 20 tools, right? This goes back to that evolving nature of application security being beyond just the scanners, right? To actually know what you're doing with your application security, it is going to require a lot of tools. Now, we all know, especially in software, that it always starts with the people, and that is what I will give the DevSecOps market credit with, that it starts with the people, right? The DevSecOps movement really embrace that cultural transformation, that security is part of all of our jobs. But then the process and then the tools. And what DevSecOps did wrong was try to shove the tools into the middle of DevOps without integrating the process. And this is why CISOs recognize that security is still seen as an impediment to time to market. At the end of the day, our organizations are all shipping code and doing it with DevOps as a competitive advantage to make sure we're delivering the most innovative features to market in a timely fashion. And we're capturing the productivity benefits, the efficiency benefits of, again, and not to sound like a broken record, but I'm pretty sure that's my job up here on this so-called stage, is to make sure we're doing the right things at the right time. So when we have this whole hairball that we're dealing with, and we have too few people on the security side, is the solution to make everybody a security expert? No, because there's a 3 million person shortage in security talent. And if we could make everybody security experts, we would. The same way, if we could make everybody developers, we would. But that's just not the nature of humans, right? So how do we move away from security being a bottleneck to security actually being integrated into our processes? Well, this is what we call the concept of continuous security. Before I dig into this, I'm going to talk about, I want to just like level set. I'm going to get a little academic here for a second. DevOps, CI/CD, the word at the core of the CI/CD is continuous. And what that word continuous embodies is the fact that we are able to continuously adapt to make sure that our processes and the code that we ship continuously meets the needs of the business without friction. And security has failed to be a part of that, which means that things may have been constantly changing, and a change could just be as simple as a backlog item changing, right? Hey, we're constantly reprioritizing. That's why we do 2-week sprints. It's not to ship a bunch of bad code out there, but to reprioritize in a healthy manner. But to be continually evolving our code to meet the most current needs of the business. And when we don't have security as part of that, we're only getting half the equation on that. So to be able, so what is continuous security, right? I'm introducing a big concept here. So let me take a step back before we really dive into this, right? So like CI and CD is about leveraging integration to ensure code is always ready to ship. Continuous security is the process of ensuring code is always ready to ship in line with the security processes and procedures, right? So it's not in line with whether or not a certain number of vulnerabilities or certain class of vulnerability came back or a scan was just done. Unless that's part of a process or procedure, and we know what that process or procedure was, you're not doing security, right? Just scanning is not doing security. You have to understand what that process and procedure is so you know whether or not your code is ready to ship in line with it. And I'm going to take a big step and say, you actually don't even need a single tool to be able to have a good application security program. Now, it'll be good and not great, but like the rest of DevOps, if you set out and work with your security teams, and you can do this on individual teams before scaling it across an entire organization, if you set out what that process is and know whether or not you did it and when you accepted that you didn't and why you accepted it, you will have good application security. Obviously, the tools turn that into a great program because you get more robust data. And we'll talk about that in a second, how that data supports the process instead of becomes the hindrance that we have seen to date in this DevSecOps movement. So how can we get continuous security? And before I introduce these 5 steps, I want everybody on this call to know that you do not have to have some kind of full-blown CI/CD to be able to do this. We know that that's a little bit of a utopian concept to ever have a full-blown CI/CD. And if you do, amazing, you're part of a very small fraction of it. And you also do not have to be shipping code every day to need this. As long as you have a software development lifecycle, AKA a process you follow to make sure code goes from inception to out the door, you can and have continuous security. So we actually have customers that are still on, what I'd call agile fall, right? They're still really only doing shipping twice a year. They may have minor updates, but they integrate security as part of their process in every day. So that way, when they go to ship only twice a year, they know they have that confidence that they have followed the right procedures and they've accepted risk in place. So do not think that you have to wait. And for those that are in the middle of a DevOps transformation, do not think you have to wait to be complete with your DevOps transformation, because as you will find out, this is one of the core tenets. It is a journey of continuous improvement. This is the time to do it now. So make sure security is as part of your processes and procedures. This is how you can do it. The first step is to categorize, right? We all know that there are a certain set of design attributes by which we organize our projects, right? You're not coming up with a bunch of new ones every time. And when you do, that's going to be part of a bigger conversation. Good security starts in planning, like all of the rest of your development. Understand what those design attributes are and the downstream security implications. And this will then allow you to have effective planning and preparation, whatever your role is, right? It's not just all on the developers, and it's not just all on the PM. And it's not just all on the architect, right? Everybody will have their own role that they have to do it. And when you understand, we call this sort of the security project profile. When you understand the steps that you're going to need to do, you can plan and prepare for it and create some of these early feedback loops and understand what that security specific workflow is in your DevOps pipeline. The second step, as I said, and has become common verbiage nowadays, is to make sure that we're not just telling people, that security is everybody's job. We're giving them the information that they need to implement it. So there's become a very popular trend of developer-led security. No, that's just if you only push that down to the developer, one, you're going to create a big headache for yourself, but it's just putting the bottleneck in a new place. Right? So I often say that it's kind of like QA. Just because we were able to get QA tools that could be developer level didn't mean we eliminated the role of QA, didn't mean developers were responsible for all QA, right? We found the right places and times for developers to leverage that in their workflows and then still have a broader QA process. If you start to think about security processes and how you integrate that into the various development roles, right, this is not a new concept of it, right? So what we're doing is we're delivering, in a sense, bite-sized security to the architect back in their ticketing system, to the developer directly in their IDE. This allows both development teams to make educated decisions in real time and understand what the test plan is, as well as provide attestation. And I don't say attestation just from an audit perspective. It sounds like a really big formal word, because if you're only implementing security with a compliance mindset, you're going to fail to actually capture the benefits like you have with the rest of your DevOps pipeline of saying we're creating real-time response and micro feedback loops so that we can make educated decisions in vivo, right? So a developer may actually come back and say, yes, I understand this is a policy. I did not follow this. You asked me to do a 15-minute timeout on a batch import, or because I'm dealing with PII. Okay, that doesn't work because it's going to keep timing out. A developer, when you create these little feedback loops and allow them to be engaged in part of the process, this, you are going to be able to make a decision in line before it becomes a problem later down the road, right? This is about taking the time to do the right things at the right time. And however, the flip side is when you implement this correctly, you can also create blockages. And this is where we do start to get into the tools and the automation, right? So it could actually be kind of like a not completed pull request, that if a developer hasn't followed a policy or hasn't made that attestation, then that you block that branch from being committed. So these are all the different things that go into part of a process. The process is not to say you do something yes or no. That's not a binary. It's not a binary process. You do something, and then if you don't do it, here's what has to happen next. So we can make sure the right people know that. And for some projects, that sign off might just be the self-attestation. For crown jewels, that might go all the way up, right? But when you have that process, you know right away what that's going to be. And when you've delivered that information effectively, development teams are now empowered to actually own application security in their DevOps pipeline, while security still gets that accountability that they crave. So I did say tools aren't the core of it, but they do obviously make for a more robust, richer application security program. So it's to be expected, and if you aren't, you should at least be scanning with one tool, right? A scan and frequently and on a regular schedule, whatever's right though, right? And make sure you know that that's all part of the process tool. There are some of your applications, it will not be worth or scanning every time you ship. Others, you'll want to scan every 5 days. That's what security is actually trying to do. PSA number 3, right? They actually know that. They're not trying to force you to wait for every scan from every tool. Well, when you set out that process from the beginning, from that categorization, where you get some kind of security profile to understand what the workflow is, you will now know what that tool set is and what the responses need to be. So when you bring those responses in, to avoid going back to the place of having that DevSecOps hairball, you need to make sure there's context, right? Evaluate this in the context of your application. For those that work in a bank, imagine a bill pay platform is going to have a very different risk tolerance for an availability vulnerability than your trading platform, right? That bill pay platform goes down for 10 minutes. It's not great, but you have other redundancies in place. That's a brand image issue. So, and if you have articulated the project security process, you know that in advance and delivered that information. So you could deprioritize that medium availability vulnerability, where a trading platform, you have no risk tolerance for availability vulnerabilities and availability risk. So you need to find a way to bring that in. For those that haven't seen the NIST CVSS calculator, that is a great way to at least just get your head around it. It's not scalable. You do need automation to make that assessment in that context scalable, but at least be able to sit down and have that conversation to say, here's what my project cares about. Oh, here's how I'm going to manage my security debt as part of my technical debt. We know everything can't be shipped. Security will put some, guardrails on what has to absolutely be fixed. But when you bring that context to the data, that's when you get information and you can make those educated decisions. And you do need to aggregate security results, right? This is a problem where if these are not, and it is a problem where a lot of these results do end up in Excel spreadsheets, you need to find a way to aggregate these results beyond just, we have 30 criticals from tool 1, 30 criticals from tool 2, 30 criticals from tool 3. That is what is creating a lot of that consternation about, oh, I don't want to have, why am I supposed to fix this? I don't know how to fix that. I have 1,000 other bugs that I have to do it. When you start to aggregate them, you don't just get that context, it starts to become a smaller problem, right? And so you have to figure out, is it by a specific vulnerability class? Is it by a specific ranking, whatever it is, that's all something that you should be deciding back in that initial categorization phase, like you do for everything else. and that allows you to make those decisions in real time. And then ultimately, this isn't a new step, but this authorization step has just been held up because a lot of it, the reality is stuck in an Excel spreadsheet or in emails or over the wall shipping, or I'm going to ship it and ask later, right? Beg forgiveness later. That checklist is not a real quality gate. Can you imagine for all of your other quality gates, if you had some kind of Excel spreadsheet that you had to go do to make sure you could ship, you'd never ship code. You need to find a way. And if you followed the previous 3 steps, this gate, whether you have the automation or not, obviously automation and does always make everything more scalable, but whether you have the automation or not, you already have all the answers to whatever that quality gate is going to be. So rather than getting to the very end and being ready to ship your code, release your code and having to go back and ask all these questions, you know the answers because you created, as we discussed before, those micro feedback loops and had people sign off in real time about whether or not they were willing to accept that risk, and you got the right people to sign off. I do also want to introduce something else really important, is this concept of what's your environment level tolerance, right? Authorization. We don't just go from, our devs laptops out into production, right? We have this whole process and we go through multiple environments to say to be able to continue to reach our goal of shipping code into production, but get different levels of testing. So you need to adopt that as part of your security process to say what's okay for this environment without losing in sight of what good to go is for the ultimate goal, which is production, right? So just think about it. In QA, you wouldn't have all of your bugs fixed. So why would you have all of your vulnerabilities fixed? You need to know what needs to get fixed to be able to go into production. But you do not need to have them all fixed. So again, by creating these early feedback loops, by creating this context, you'll go into this authorization component for every environment and know how close you are to reaching that ultimate goal, rather than doing it after the fact and trying to cobble together all these pieces together, or when you're trying to get it out the door. And ultimately, we get into monitoring, right? We know security and software are living, breathing things. And monitoring is really where that continuous component comes in, right? Just because we ship code out the door doesn't mean it's complete, right? We make that decision every day. We know there's going to have to be this continuous process. Some of it may just be that security portion of your tech debt that you have to fix, and there may be SLAs associated with it. So if we go back to some of those earlier concepts, like assessing them and categorizing them appropriately, we know what has to get fixed when, beyond just all mediums have to be fixed within 2 releases or something like that. But we get more granular context to make sure we're continually prioritizing and reprioritizing. But it allows us to dynamically manage security as part of our CI/CD as changes occur to the tech stack, to what you're actually developing, to your priorities there, or as changes occur externally on the security threat landscape side. Because if you followed a process, and you follow the continuous security process, what's going to be impacted by a change on either side. And when you get to this, you can start to dynamically manage security the same way you dynamically manage everything else. This is a great time of year to think about retailers. I don't know if we have any in the crowd, but retailers notoriously go into a tech lockdown from mid-October to mid-January. And so for that 3-month period, we know the technology is not changing, but the security world is still changing. And what their risk tolerance is different during that 3-month period for availability than it is the rest of the year. So when you get into this continuous security mindset, then and you can dynamically manage. And that goes back to de-risking the business, not just de-risking if your website gets hacked and goes down and you lose millions of dollars in sales because somebody jumps to another Black Friday sale. Oh, but to be able to manage developer productivity in terms of where they spend their time and what resources they leverage during that time period differently than the rest of the 9 months, right? It also brings more security confidence and overall business confidence that you have made a decision about security the same way you have about all the other bugs out there and all the other technical components. And ultimately, this leads to just a core tenet of why we do DevOps, and even just any kind of dating all the way back to the scientific method, right? The goal of following a process is so that we can capture data and continuously improve. And this allows for that conversation between security and development to say, how can we go ahead and make our application security program better? Not to just keep the bad guys out, but to make sure we're doing the right things to support the business needs. And business needs at the end of the day are about delivering on your promise to the customer. So that's why you've got to adopt a continuous improvement mindset to really be delivering on continuous security. So when we bring together these 5 steps, right? And these 5 steps shouldn't really feel weird to you, right? This is what you're doing and everything else. You've just got to take, and this is going to be a partnership with you and security, but you've got to go have that conversation to say, stop telling me what the rules are. Help me determine what the process is. And so I can make these decisions as a development team or as an individual stakeholder in development. And we can work together when there's a problem. Famously, when Wabi was being founded, a CISO said to me, what's different about application security than the rest of security that hasn't translated into this modern cybersecurity world is that it's all about the process, right? If we can find a way for development to own that process while security then gets pulled in just when there's an emergency, that's how we deploy effective application security here. So think about all of these steps. These are just things you do already in your day-to-day lives that your teams do. So they categorize, they implement, they assess, they authorize, they monitor. Go back to your security team or to the security documentation you have and identify what that is. I challenge you to do that on the next project, right? Go set out a process and say, we know at the very beginning, here are the rules we have to follow, right? It's not that whole ocean of application security policies. Every application has a subset of that. Work with security to determine that. Then make sure every team member has the information they need, and more importantly, the opportunity to provide feedback. Then when the results come back in, assess them in line with what your application's priorities are. If you really don't care about confidentiality on something, that's not, no matter how critical confidentiality vulnerability is in the world of vulnerabilities, that doesn't mean that that's probably not actually important to your application. You can deprioritize that. So take that lens on it. And then that authorization stage almost becomes irrelevant, right? You already know by the time you get to authorization whether or not it's going to be authorized. And if it's not going to be authorized, have a conversation about whether it's good to ship or what actually is a blocker and get those appropriate sign-offs. And then get into this monitoring component, saying, how are we going to continually evolve when there are changes? Who's going to notify us? Who needs to be notified? What are the ones we need to be notified for? And that's how you can capture continuous security as part of your existing pipeline. You do not need to do anything differently to remove that bottleneck and transform security from being that cork that everything's trying to seep around to just being part of the process, right? Being integrated in to that delivery mechanism. right? And notice I did not turn any of these little icons suddenly into security experts, right? Hey, we're not asking your teams to become security experts. That's impossible, right? As brilliant as they are, or what we're asking them to do and enabling and empowering development teams to do is to know what their piece of the puzzle is so that ultimately that code keeps going out the door. But I do want to, before we wrap up, I want to come back to that stat of 48% of organizations are regularly pushing vulnerable code and they know it. So as a final thought, I do want you to keep thinking about this in this continuous security mindset. What is vulnerable, right? If you implement continuous security, what you will get is an understanding of what is vulnerable to your company, to your application, to even your version, right? Because you're going to be able to update those processes, and even down to your environment, right? What do I care about here? So as we're just coming up on the end of this session, if you remember nothing else, to get that bottleneck out of your DevOps pipeline, there are three things. One, remember, next time you're having a conversation with security and all you think they want to do is stop your code from shipping, remember that good application security is about process, right? And then say, how can I be empowered to make educated decisions as a development stakeholder and participant, right? Security is setting out that process. How can we, I often use the word assimilate their process into our development process so that we as a development organization, whatever your role may be, can be empowered to make educated decisions. And remember that security is not static, like the rest of our organization. And security is not static. It should and can be managed dynamically. But if you don't have the first two steps, you won't get there. And if you really remember nothing else, and this may be a mantra that you want to share with your application security friends, right? PSA number 4. There is no perfect code, and therefore there can be no perfect security. So when you remember that, and remember that that is actually security's goal as well, is to enable you to empower you to make those decisions and that you do every day with your code to say what's good enough, what can be fixed later, but how are we meeting the business needs and more importantly, the customer needs today with the code that we have ready to ship. Then security stops being this overwhelming hairball and bottleneck and problem that you have to deal with, and just another piece of the development process that you're already doing. I don't think any of the steps I said today were foreign concepts. All you need to do is shift how you think about this and start to engage in the conversation to say, we ship imperfect code every day. How can we make sure we're applying that same mechanism where we make educated decisions about what is good enough to ship to security? And that is how you'll finally be able to integrate security into development pipelines. Go back to that process. Thank you all so much for joining me today. I'm going to hang out here on the live chat for a little bit longer, but I please don't hesitate to reach out. If you have any questions, I'd love to continue this conversation virtually or in person, however it may be. But thank you for your time today, and take care and have a great Thanksgiving.